Hello, my name is Pierina. The complex problem that I will be addressing in this presentation is about the impact of COVID on students. The pandemic has affected people's life in many ways, regardless of their nationality, level of education, income, or gender. But the same hasn't been true for its consequence, which has hit the most vulnerable hardest. Education is not an exception. Since the crisis started, students were forced to change to remote learning without being prepared, affecting their life and academic performance in many ways. As expected, the consequences of school shutdowns to control the spread exposed and worsened other significant problems. Although students in general are being affected by the pandemic, students from low socioeconomic communities and communities of color were found to be disproportionately affected. The impact of underfunding and lack of educational resources seen in some school districts worsen many students' circumstances that don't have the access that don't have access to technologies or other necessary resources. Even before the pandemic started, educational inequality in public schools has been a huge problem that has highly affected minority groups and those of low socioeconomic status. Some study has shown that there is a large achievement gap between high and low income students and between black and white students. Some possible explanations of such a gap is the economy segregation between school districts, which creates inequality in the economy of social resources available to students. When families are highly segregated by income between school districts, resources that contributed to students' academic success such as school funding, teachers' quality, parents' social capital, and students' peer characteristics are more unequal distributed. So, in order to understand that disparity in public education, we should look at gaps in funding. Public school districts use a combination of state funds, local resources such as property taxes, in some cases, income taxes, and federal funds. Each state has its own formula for how funding for schools is collected and distributed. But because nearly half of those funds come from local property taxes in many states, the system generates large funding differences between wealthy and poor communities. Sorry. Um, The amount of state funds that a district receives is based on a formula that takes into account the student's enrollment and the property wealth of the district. In this case, the state have the responsibility to make sure schools have um a res- sorry so make sure school have sufficient funding to operate, and schools have the responsibility to ensure every student receives a quality education. In most cases, fundings are divided by students. In Ohio, funds also come from federal, state, and local government. Yet, the largest shares come from local sources in every district. Ohio school districts are highly dependent on property taxes based on the local tax base. The applied tax rate is voted by constituents, and the money um, ultimately comes through the form of levies. That money is then supplemented by state aid. The state funds primary and secondary education is one of the largest expenditures in the Ohio state legislatures. These funds, along with profits from the Ohio lottery, are used to fund school districts. These are some examples of how funds are distributed in some districts. In its most recent report card detailing its revenue types, Cincinnati Public Schools received about 46% of its budget from local dollars in contrast to about 37% from the state. The remaining 17% of the budget came from federal money and other miscellaneous sources. Um, Another local district, Mason City Schools, has a similar breakdown. 49% of Mason City School expenses are funded by local revenues, while 39% of the budgets come from the state. The remaining revenue is supplied by federal government and non tax sources like public utilities, agriculture, properties, and residential constructions. As you can see, state funds are significantly important, but the way it's distributed through the districts is highly complicated. The formula that Ohio used for schools funding has been found unconstitutional for the fourth time. The amount of state funds that each district receives is based on a formula that, as I said before, it takes into account the student enrollment and the property wealth of the district. Also, the funding system in Ohio heavily relies on property taxes, which is a problem because it creates an equal distribution of fundings between districts. So it benefits those who are from high income districts only, failing students in poor rural or urban areas. So why funds are so important? More funds allow school districts to spend money wisely and have better outcomes, including higher test scores and other improved indicators of student achievement. More money also helps ensure that students have schools with better facilities and more curriculum options. So if public schools were funded properly, they could do other things that they need to do, such as a smaller class size, hiring social workers, psychologists to address the trauma and mental health issues in students. In other words, poorly educated child has fewer and fewer options. So how COVID aggravated the situations? Well, school shutdowns has extended a student's gap in educational achievement. The transition to remote learning has affected students differently. No, the student had access to resources like internet. Many students from of low social economy might experience some food insecurity and other issues, which affects their school performance and mental health. Some school districts are unable to provide support to these students because of the limited resources that they have. The pandemic overall has affected students differently. The school closures and the transition to remote learning has left some students behind. So there is a great need for schools to provide more support to students. Um, but in order to address these problems, a better formula for funding education is required. Like we see in Ohio, relying on property taxes, creating an equal distribution of funds that only benefits the wealthy districts.